Story 1. I've been diving for years, 10, maybe 12, but no dive had ever unnerved me like the one that night. I live in Cairns, Australia, right on the edge of the Great Barrier Reef. It's a diver's paradise, sure, but the reef can be as deadly as it is beautiful. I learned that the hard way. It started as an ordinary night dive. Just me and two buddies, Jake and Miranda. Jake's been diving as long as I have. He's cocky but solid. Miranda was newer to the game, but had a calmness underwater that most beginners don't have. The plan was to explore a section of the reef known for its caves and swim-throughs. People called it Turtle Hollow. Supposedly, it was where green sea turtles went to rest. We descended into the inky black water, flashlights cutting narrow beams through the abyss. The ocean at night is another world entirely. It swallows you whole, leaving just you, your team, and whatever creatures decide to glide into your light. We swam for about 20 minutes when Jake signaled us to stop. He pointed ahead to a dark, jagged opening in the coral wall, a cave. The entrance was big enough to drive a small car through. This was it, Turtle Hollow. I didn't know then that we should have turned back. We hovered at the entrance, shining our flashlights inside. The beams revealed nothing at first, just shadows and rock. Miranda moved closer, her light sweeping across the cave walls. Then Jake signaled something, a hand gesture I didn't immediately recognize. His flashlight froze on something deep inside the cave. I followed his beam. At first I didn't understand what I was looking at, just a shadow, big and unmoving. Then the shadow shifted. Something huge, a flipper, slowly extended into the light. It was easily the length of my entire arm. My stomach twisted. Turtle, I thought, trying to steady my breathing. Just a big turtle. Jake's light darted back and forth, illuminating more of the creature. The shell came into view, curved and ancient-looking, covered in patches of algae and scars. But it wasn't the size of the shell that made my heart race. It was the thing's head. The turtle's head emerged from the darkness, slowly, deliberately. It was massive, the size of a beach ball, with eyes that glinted like black marbles in the flashlight beam. Its skin was rough, almost leathery, and its mouth was slightly open, revealing jagged, serrated edges. It didn't look like any green sea turtle I'd ever seen. Jake turned to me, his eyes wide behind his mask. He signaled for us to back away, but Miranda was already moving closer, her light fixed on the creature. She seemed mesmerized. I wanted to grab her, pull her back, but I couldn't move. Something about the way the turtle stared at us, at me, made my body freeze. It felt like it was watching, waiting. Then it moved. It wasn't fast, but the sheer size of it made the motion terrifying. The turtle pushed itself out of the cave, its flippers stirring the water in slow, powerful strokes. Up close, the shell looked even more battered, like it had survived centuries of battles. Miranda was closest to it. She reached out as if to touch the creature, and that's when it happened. The turtle lunged, its jaws snapped shut, the sound echoing through the water like a muffled gunshot. Miranda yanked her hand back just in time, her flashlight dropping to the ocean floor. The turtle didn't stop. It surged forward, its massive body filling the space between us. I kicked backward, panic overtaking me. Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me away, but the turtle wasn't after us. It was focused on Miranda. She tried to swim backward, but the turtle was too fast. Its jaws snapped again, missing her leg by inches. I wanted to help, but what could I do against something so massive? Jake and I hovered, helpless, as Miranda dodged the creature's attacks. It didn't seem to want to kill her, though. It was almost like it was playing with her, testing her. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The turtle floated there, its eyes locked on Miranda. For a moment, everything was still. Then it turned, slowly, and retreated into the cave. We didn't wait around. Jake grabbed Miranda, and we swam as fast as we could, not stopping until we were back on the boat. No one said a word as we ripped off our gear. Miranda was shaking, her face pale. "What the hell was that?" Jake finally said, his voice trembling. "A turtle," I said, though the words felt hollow. "No," Miranda whispered. "That wasn't just a turtle. It knew what it was doing." I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those jaws, those eyes. We never reported the incident. Who would believe us? A giant turtle attacked us? Sounds ridiculous, but I haven't been back to that part of the reef since. Story 2. I live in a quiet fishing town on the northern coast of Germany, nestled between jagged cliffs and an unyielding sea. It's the kind of place where the wind howls like a grieving widow, and the salt air bites deep into your skin. Everyone here grows up knowing the water's capricious moods. It nurtures us, feeds us, and sometimes, if it takes a fancy, it claims us. I've always been a practical man, skeptical. My friends joke that I don't believe in anything I can't touch or taste, but what happened to me on that cold, silent stretch of water still chills my blood to this day. I'd swear by it, though part of me wishes I couldn't. It started 2 winters ago. I was out alone, as I often am, rowing a small boat about 5 kilometers off the coast. The engine on my trawler had broken down the day before, so I borrowed an old wooden skiff to retrieve some crab pots I'd left behind. The weather forecast promised calm seas and clear skies, but out here, forecasts are worth as much as the wind's promises. By noon, a low fog rolled in, thick as smoke, and I lost sight of the shoreline. I wasn't worried at first. My sense of direction is sharp. I've been navigating these waters since I was a boy, and I figured the fog would lift before long. But the hours dragged on, and the gray became absolute. I couldn't even tell where the sun was anymore. Worse, my oars began to feel heavy, and my throat grew parched. It was strange. I'd packed plenty of water for the short trip, but it wasn't in the boat. I must have forgotten it on the dock. By mid-afternoon, the fog turned the sea into a swirling mirror, stretching endlessly in every direction. No waves, no breeze, just the hollow sound of my breathing, and then I heard them. It began faintly, a sound I thought might have been the distant cry of gulls. But there were no birds in that dead stillness. It grew louder, clearer, a melody, haunting, beckoning. It seemed to come from the water itself, all around me, echoing through the mist. A woman's voice, or maybe several. I couldn't be sure. I told myself it was just the strain of rowing and the dehydration messing with my mind. But it was so beautiful. At first I ignored it. I focused on rowing, even though my arms felt like lead. I was trying to keep calm, trying to reason my way through the situation. The fog will clear, I told myself. Just stay steady. But then I saw them, or something. Figures moved in the water, just beneath the surface. Not fish, not dolphins. Their outlines were wrong, slender and twisting, like ribbons of silk caught in an unseen current. I leaned over the side, squinting, and that's when I saw her face. She was looking up at me from the depths, pale, otherworldly, with eyes that seemed far too large, glimmering like polished shells. Her hair floated around her, shimmering in the dim light, and her lips curved into the faintest smile. I gasped and jerked back, nearly tipping the boat. I told myself it wasn't real. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "You're losing it," I muttered. "Just keep rowing." But the voices grew louder, and when I glanced back at the water, she was closer. This time, her hand broke the surface. It was thin, almost translucent, with fingers that seemed too long. "Come to us," a voice whispered, and I swear it came from everywhere at once. I shouted back, "No!" My voice sounded small in the vast emptiness. My heart pounded, but I kept rowing, pushing the oars with what little strength I had left. The boat groaned under me, and the water lapped at the sides in rhythmic sloshes, almost like a heartbeat. But they didn't leave me alone. More faces appeared in the water, dozens of them, all beautiful, all smiling, all wrong. Their mouths moved, forming words I didn't understand, though their meaning was clear. They wanted me. One by one, their hands broke the surface, trailing fingers along the sides of the boat. They weren't pulling it, not yet, just testing. A cold, unearthly calm swept over me, and for a moment I wanted to go with them. It didn't feel like drowning. It felt like surrender. But then I thought of my daughter, Hannah. She's 12. Her laughter is like sunshine on these bleak northern days. If I gave in to them, who would teach her how to navigate the tides? Who would be there to hold her when storms rolled in? That thought broke the trance. No, I roared, louder this time. I grabbed one of the oars and swung it wildly, striking at the water. It didn't connect with anything, but the act of defiance seemed to scatter them. Their faces blurred, vanishing into the depths, and the voices faded to a mournful hum. The fog began to thin. I don't know how long I rode after that. An hour, maybe two, until I finally spotted the faint outline of the cliffs. When I reached the shore, my legs gave out, and I collapsed in the sand. A fisherman I knew found me there and hauled me back to town. I told him I got lost in the fog, left out the rest. What was I supposed to say? The next morning, I went back to the dock to return the skiff. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Thin, translucent streaks on the wood, like the marks of fingers dragged through salt. My stomach turned. I said nothing. I've avoided the water ever since. I sold my boat, found work mending nets on the shore instead. Sometimes I hear the others talk about strange things they've seen out there. Lights under the waves, whispers on the wind. But I stay quiet. Story 3. I've always been a practical person, grounded in reason. I work as an architect in Hamburg, and my life is all about logic, numbers, and tangible results. That's why what happened to me during my vacation last summer is something I still struggle to explain, something I hesitate to even talk about. It started as a solo trip to clear my mind. I had been working long hours and I needed the silence of the water, the simplicity of rowing. I rented a small rowboat in a remote fishing village along the Baltic coast, planning to spend a couple of days exploring the calm seas. No internet, no phone calls, just me, the ocean, and the horizon. The first day was idyllic. I rowed until my shoulders ached, then let the current drift me toward a quiet bay. I watched the sun sink below the waterline, the sky bleeding orange and purple. I felt free, untethered. By nightfall, I tied the boat to a buoy, ate a packed meal, and fell asleep under the stars. The second day, the weather turned. The sky was overcast, the wind colder. I didn't mind. I liked the grayness of it all. But by mid-morning, I realized I'd miscalculated. The current was stronger than I anticipated, dragging me farther from shore. My arms burned as I rowed, but it was like fighting quicksand. By noon, I could barely see the coastline, just a smudge of green on the horizon. And then my water bottle tipped over. It was stupid, really. I'd left it balanced on the edge of the bench. And when I shifted to adjust the oar, it slid off and emptied itself onto the floorboards. It wasn't my only supply, but it was the last of the fresh water I'd brought for that day. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I'd head back to shore and refill. But as the hours dragged on and the land grew more distant, the weight of that spilled water started pressing down on me. By the time the sun set, I was still adrift. The current had taken me somewhere vast and unrecognizable. My phone had no signal. My arms trembled from exertion, and my throat was dry. I tried not to panic. The village wasn't far. Someone would spot me eventually. All I had to do was wait. But the night was something else. It was so dark out there, darker than I'd ever known. The kind of dark where you can't see your own hand in front of your face. The waves lapped against the boat, steady and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock. I tried to sleep, but my throat ached and my mind wouldn't stop racing. Hours passed. The stars wheeled overhead. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I remember was waking to a sound, a voice. It was soft at first, just a faint melody drifting on the wind. I sat up, heart pounding, thinking I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A woman's voice singing. The notes were strange, foreign, and they carried a haunting, echoing quality that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking from dehydration. "Is someone there?" The singing stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. My skin prickled, and I felt the weight of the darkness around me, like something unseen was pressing in. Then slowly, I heard the water shift beside the boat, as if something or someone was moving just beneath the surface. I scrambled to the edge, peering into the black water. At first I saw nothing, just the faint reflection of starlight. But then I saw them, eyes pale and glowing, like twin lanterns submerged just below the surface. They stared up at me unblinking, and I froze, unable to look away. "Join us," a voice whispered, soft, lilting, but unmistakably clear. It wasn't my imagination. I heard it as plainly as my own thoughts. My breath caught, and I jerked back, nearly capsizing the boat. My mind raced. It was the dehydration, I told myself. The heat, the exhaustion. But even as I clung to that explanation, I couldn't shake the sensation of those eyes watching me. The voice came again, stronger this time, and it wasn't alone. There were others now, singing in harmony, their words weaving together in a language I didn't recognize. The melody was beautiful, achingly so, and it filled me with a longing I couldn't describe, like a deep ache in my chest. "Join us," they whispered again, louder this time. I covered my ears, but the sound seeped through as if it was coming from inside my own head. I felt drawn to the edge of the boat, my body moving of its own accord. My hand reached out, trembling toward the water. "No!" I shouted, snapping myself back to reality. I gripped the oar like a lifeline, forcing myself to stay seated. My heart pounded in my chest, and my throat burned with thirst. The singing stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The water, the air, even the boat seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, something slammed into the hull from below, hard enough to send me sprawling. I screamed, clutching the sides of the boat as it rocked violently. "Join us!" The voices chanted, their tone turning sharp, insistent. The glowing eyes multiplied, surrounding the boat. I could see pale shapes moving beneath the surface, their forms lithe and unnatural. I panicked. Grabbing the oar, I swung it wildly at the water, shouting and cursing. The boat pitched and swayed, but I didn't care. I wasn't going down without a fight. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The boat steadied. The water went still. The voices fell silent. I sat there, gasping for breath, my body trembling. The glowing eyes were gone. The sea stretched out around me, vast and empty. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, heavy, like the calm before a storm. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I saw land in the distance. I rowed harder than I ever had in my life, my arms screaming in protest, my throat raw from thirst. By the time I reached the shore, I collapsed in the sand, too exhausted to move. The villagers found me hours later. They said I was dehydrated, delirious. They laughed when I told them about the voices, the eyes. "The sea plays tricks on you," one old fisherman said, "makes you see things that aren't there." But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I haven't been back to the water since. Story 4, I used to serve aboard the Horizon Striker, a frigate patrolling the waters off the coast of Malaysia. Life on the ship was routine for the most part. Long nights of watching the radar, drills that kept us sharp, and the distant hum of the engine that seemed to work its way into your bones. But nothing prepared me for what happened during that deployment. It started like any other night. We were cruising well beyond sight of land, the moon hanging low, its reflection broken by gentle waves. The heat was relentless, even at sea, and I remember standing by the rail, trying to catch any hint of a breeze. That's when the call came over the radio. "All hands, stand by. Unidentified object spotted at 2 o'clock. Prepare for retrieval." I was assigned to the retrieval detail, so I grabbed my gear and joined the others near the davit. The air was electric, a mix of curiosity and unease. Unidentified objects weren't unheard of. Debris, old fishing nets, the occasional piece of cargo. But there was something about the captain's tone. It wasn't just protocol, it was strained. The spotlight cut through the darkness as we approached. At first I thought it was a buoy or a log. It floated awkwardly, half submerged. Then as we drew closer, the shape became clearer. Human. The bloated, discolored body of a man, adrift in the open sea. None of us said anything. I think we were all hoping it wasn't what it clearly was. The body was swollen beyond recognition, its limbs stiff and awkward. The stench hit us before we even had it in the recovery net. A rancid, putrid smell that turned my stomach. "God," muttered Daniels, the guy next to me, covering his nose with his sleeve. "What the hell happened to him?" "Focus," barked Chief Hernandez. "Get it aboard. We'll worry about the rest later." The net tightened around the body and we hauled it onto the deck. The water streaming off it was dark and viscous, tainting the air with something foul. Up close, the damage was worse than I imagined. The skin was stretched taut, mottled with green and black patches, and the abdomen looked ready to burst. Flies, where had they come from out here, buzzed around it in thick, frenzied swarms. "Roll him over," Hernandez ordered. His voice was steady, but I caught the edge of hesitation. Daniels and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us wanted to touch it, but orders were orders. I gritted my teeth, grabbed the edge of the net, and helped shift the corpse. And then I saw it. The face, or where the face should have been, was just gone. Not eaten, not rotted away, but smooth, like it had been scrubbed clean of every feature. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just pale, glistening flesh stretched over bone. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, my boots slipping on the slick deck. "What the hell is that?" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. Where's his face?" No one answered. The others stood frozen, staring, the moment dragging into a silence so heavy I swear I could hear my own heartbeat. Hernandez was the first to speak, but even he sounded shaken. "Get the tarp. Cover it. Now." We obeyed, grateful to shield ourselves from the sight. The body was wrapped tightly, sealed away like we could pretend it wasn't there. But the image burned into my mind didn't care about tarps or orders. That faceless head, that impossible, unnatural blankness. The rest of the crew gave us a wide berth as we secured the body in the cold storage. No one asked questions. No one wanted to know more than they had to. When we finished, Hernandez dismissed us with a gruff, "Get some rest." Rest. Right. As if I could sleep after that. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over. What had happened to that man? Drowning didn't do that. Sharks didn't do that. I'd seen death at sea before, but this was wrong. Every instinct screamed that we had brought something aboard that didn't belong, something that defied explanation. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to a loud bang echoing through the ship. My heart leaped as I scrambled to my feet, pulling on my boots and grabbing my flashlight. The corridors were dim, the emergency lighting casting long, eerie shadows. Others were up too, murmuring nervously as they gathered near the mess hall. "Did you hear it?" someone asked. "Came from the storage area," said another. The storage area, where we'd left the body. Hernandez appeared, barking orders to clear the halls, but he didn't stop me and Daniels from tagging along as he headed toward the source of the noise. I think he knew we wouldn't have listened anyway. The door to the storage room was ajar, the heavy padlock dangling uselessly from its hinge. Hernandez swore under his breath, drawing his sidearm. He motioned for us to follow as he pushed the door open. The cold hit me first, sharp and biting. The air reeked of ammonia and decay, worse than before. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, landing on the tarp. It was crumpled on the floor, empty, empty. The body was gone. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands shook as I swept the light across the room. Nothing. Just empty shelves and that damn tarp. Hernandez cursed again, louder this time, and motioned for us to check the perimeter. We searched the entire ship that night, top to bottom, every nook and cranny. But we didn't find it. The body, if it had ever been a body, was gone. And no one wanted to admit it, but we all felt it. A presence, lingering, oppressive, like we were being watched. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound amplified. Sleep became impossible. Conversations were hushed, fear thick in the air. By the time we reached port a week later, the entire crew was on edge. No one spoke about the body, not to each other, not in the reports. It was like an unspoken pact. Whatever had happened out there was best left at sea. I left the Navy after that deployment. I couldn't stay. Story 5. I'm Mark, and I live in a small coastal town in Maine. Sailing's in my blood. My grandfather was a fisherman, my dad a Navy man, and me? I just love the sea. It's where I feel most alive. A few years back, I joined some friends on a week-long sailing cruise from the Bahamas to Miami. We'd been diving, sunning, and swapping stories, a perfect trip. That is until the night I'll never forget. The last leg of the trip had us skimming across a calm ocean under a fading orange sunset. The crew, who doubled as our guides, decided to have dinner together, leaving the wheel to me. I was more than eager. The open sea and a compass were all I needed. "Just keep her steady on 275 degrees, one of them said with a casual wave. "Got it," I replied, gripping the wheel. I stood there staring at the compass like it was my only lifeline. The horizon was a faint line between sky and sea, and the gentle hum of the engine mixed with the soft clinking of plates behind me. That's when I noticed the sun. It wasn't just setting, it was dipping fast, unnaturally fast. Or at least, that's how it felt. At first I thought it was my imagination, maybe the wine I'd had with dinner earlier. But no. Shadows stretched long and sharp across the deck, the golden light growing cold, eerie. The compass was acting strange too. I thought I must have been veering off course because the needle jittered, swinging slightly to the left. I adjusted. The needle swung again, adjusted again. Now it was spinning, a slow, deliberate circle, round and round like it was playing some cruel game. "What the hell?" I muttered, sweat prickling my neck. "Everything okay up there?" one of the crew called from the galley. "Yeah, I think so," I lied, trying to sound calm. But it wasn't okay, not at all. I looked up at the sky for reassurance, but the sunset was gone, swallowed by an oppressive gray that rolled in without warning. It was like someone had pulled a blanket over the horizon. The compass needle spun faster, wild now, making full revolutions. My stomach clenched as a deep vibration hummed through the deck beneath my feet. It wasn't the engine. This was something else. One of the passengers, Dave, stepped up beside me, his brow furrowed. "What's going on?" he asked. "The compass," I said, my voice shaking. "It's spinning. Look at it." He leaned in, squinting at the gauge. Then he pulled out his own dive compass, holding it steady in his hand. "Jesus," he whispered. His compass was spinning too. "Do you feel that?" I asked, gripping the wheel tighter as the hum grew louder. "Feel what?" "The vibration," I said, but as I spoke it stopped, gone, as if it had never been there. Then the air changed. The smell of salt and sea vanished, replaced by something sharp, metallic. I glanced at the GPS. Its heading remained steady, unaffected, but the rest of us, we weren't. Others came up from below deck, drawn by our anxious voices. "What's happening?" Marie, another passenger, asked, clutching the railing. "I don't know," I snapped. "Something's wrong with the compass." "Mine too," she said, showing me her dive gauge. Same thing, spinning wildly. The vibration returned, stronger this time, almost like a pulse, and the air seemed to thicken around us. Everyone fell silent, straining to hear something. Anything. That's when the scream pierced the night. It wasn't human. It came from below the waterline, a long, guttural wail that seemed to resonate inside my skull. My knees buckled, and I gripped the wheel to keep from falling. "What the hell was that?" Dave shouted. "Nobody move!" one of the crew yelled, rushing to the deck. He was pale, his eyes darting to the GPS, then the compass, then the horizon. The scream came again, louder, closer, as if whatever was making it had surfaced. I couldn't see anything, though. The water around us was inky black, its surface eerily still despite the turmoil below. "It's just the wind," someone suggested, their voice shaking. But we all knew that wasn't true. The boat lurched suddenly, throwing us sideways. I slammed into the wheel, my ribs aching as I scrambled to regain control. "What was that?" Marie cried, her voice breaking. "I don't know," I yelled back. "Something's under us." The crew scrambled to check the bilge and hull, barking orders at each other. The rest of us clung to anything solid, our eyes scanning the water for signs of... what? We didn't even know what we were looking for. The compass needle slowed, then stopped altogether. For a moment, everything went deathly quiet. No hum, no scream, no vibration, just silence. Then the boat rocked again, harder this time, as if something massive had passed beneath us. "There!" someone shouted, pointing to the water off the starboard side. I followed their gaze, my breath catching in my throat. The surface of the water rippled unnaturally, and for a split second, I saw something. A shadow, huge and serpentine, slipping just below the surface. "What is that?" Dave whispered, his voice barely audible. Nobody answered. Nobody could. The GPS beeped, its steady heading blinking back at us as if nothing had happened. The crew quickly logged our coordinates, muttering nervously among themselves. "Whatever it was," the captain said, his face grim, "it's gone now. Let's get moving." Nobody argued. We sailed on in silence, the weight of what we'd experienced pressing down on us like the ocean itself. When we reached Miami, the crew refused to discuss it further. "One of those things best left alone," the captain said, his eyes dark with something I couldn't name. Story 6. I was 21 when it happened. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it's been over a decade now. I was visiting my uncle in Tasmania, staying near Coles Bay. The air there always smelled like salt and seaweed, and the water was as clear as glass on calm days. My uncle, cousin, granddad, and I decided to take the boat out one morning to fish for flathead. It was a little aluminium thing, maybe 14 feet long. Not much, but it had always done the job. We were in good spirits, joking around as we launched into the bay. The weather had been perfect when we set out, but as it often does on the coast, it started to turn. The wind picked up, the sky clouded over, and the once calm water grew restless. My granddad, who'd been fishing these waters longer than I'd been alive, suggested we head back, but my uncle convinced us to do one last drift. We moved closer to the beach, shallow enough that we could almost make out the seabed. "It's flathead heaven here," my uncle said with a grin, casting his line. It was eerily quiet after that, the kind of quiet that settles just before something happens. The four of us sat there, rods in hand, scanning the water for any signs of life. A gull called out overhead, its cries sharp and lonely. I remember gripping my rod tightly, half-focused, when suddenly, wham! My rod jerked so violently I nearly lost my grip. The line screamed as it unraveled, and my heart was in my throat. Before I could react, the rod bent almost in half, and then, snap, the line was gone. "What the hell was that?" I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. Before I could process, my uncle let out a shout. His rod was doing the same thing, bending so far it looked like it would snap in two. He tried to reel it in, but it was no use. Another sharp crack, and his line went limp. "What are you guys snagging on?" my granddad grumbled, but there was unease in his voice. "Nothing down there but sand," my uncle replied, his face pale. "Maybe rocks," I offered weakly, though I didn't believe it. Granddad told my cousin to pull his line in. "No point wasting good tackle if we're just—" His words cut off as my cousin's rod jolted violently. "I've got something!" my cousin yelled, his face lighting up with excitement. He reeled furiously, the line pulling back with incredible force. Whatever it was fighting hard. For a second, it looked like he might win. The line came up just enough to reveal a massive, dark shadow beneath the surface. It was huge. "What the—" my cousin started, but before he could finish, the line snapped, the rod flying back and nearly hitting him in the face. We all froze. No one spoke. We just stared at the water, trying to process what we'd seen. The shadow was still there, moving slowly, deliberately. It was so big it blotted out the sandy bottom beneath it. My granddad broke the silence first, his voice low and almost shaky. "Pull the lines in, now!" We did as we were told, hands trembling as we reeled in the remaining lines. My uncle grabbed the oars, but he wasn't moving fast enough for my liking. "What was it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. I don't think anyone knew. As we watched, the shadow began to rise, just enough to see the outline of it through the water. It was a stingray, no doubt about that, but it wasn't like any stingray I'd ever seen. It had to be as long as the boat, maybe longer, and nearly as wide. Its wings moved slowly, almost hypnotically, as it glided past us. The water around it seemed darker, like it was pulling the light from the surface. I swear I could feel it watching us, though it never broke the surface. My cousin whispered, "Is it following us?" "No," my uncle said quickly, though he sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. Granddad's hands shook as he grabbed the motor's pull cord. It took 3 tries to get the engine started, and each second felt like an eternity. When the motor finally roared to life, the stingray stopped. It just hovered there, its massive body looming beneath the boat like a shadow of death itself. For a moment, I thought it might attack. I gripped the side of the boat so hard my knuckles turned white. Then just as suddenly as it appeared, it turned. Its wings moved with an eerie grace as it drifted away, disappearing into the deeper water. The tension in the boat didn't ease. We sat there, still and silent, for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. My uncle finally broke the silence. "Let's get out of here." No one argued. As we motored back to shore, the water seemed darker, the air heavier. None of us said a word. Even after we reached land and packed up the boat, the silence lingered. Later that evening, we tried to figure out what we'd seen. Granddad thought it might have been a short-tailed stingray, known to grow massive in Australian waters, but even he admitted he'd never seen one that size. My uncle joked that it was a sea monster, though his laugh was hollow. My cousin and I stayed quiet. I think we both knew there was nothing funny about what had happened, like it was something more, something that shouldn't have been there. Story 7. The story begins with me living a quiet life in a small, windswept fishing village on the northern coast. It's the kind of place where the sea is both lifeblood and menace, where fog rolls in like a living thing, smothering sound and sight. I'd grown up there, learned to respect the ocean's silence and fury. I'd heard all the stories, of course, half whispers about strange disappearances, phantom lights on the water, things that could neither be explained nor easily dismissed. But I'd always chalk them up to fishermen's tales, the kind told late at night with a bottle of schnapps. That morning, the fog was so thick it felt like we'd been swallowed by it. My friend Carl, an old-timer who'd spent more years on the sea than I'd been alive, had invited me out for a morning of fishing. His boat, a weathered but sturdy little vessel named Marin, was moored down at the harbor, barely visible in the ghostly gray light. We shoved off just before dawn, the boat's engine coughing to life and rumbling low as we drifted out into the soundless void. You couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The world beyond our small circle of vision may as well not have existed. Even the horizon had vanished, leaving only an endless wall of white and the dark, glassy surface of the water beneath us. The air was cold, damp, and unnervingly still. The fishing was slow. Bites were few and far between, and the silence settled over us like a heavy blanket. Carl was at the helm, his weathered face turned toward the nothingness ahead, while I leaned against the rail, staring into the depths. There wasn't much to do but wait, so we waited, listening to the occasional lapping of water against the hull and the mournful cry of a distant gull. After a while, the old guys started talking, their low voices cutting through the oppressive quiet. Carl was joined by his friend Henrik, who'd come along for the ride. They were reminiscing, their voices carrying that weary tone of men who had seen too much of life in the sea. "Remember that crash?" Carl asked, his voice barely above a murmur. "The one back in '78, out here in the fog, just like this?" Henrik grunted, shifting in his seat. "Hard to forget. Hundreds of people gone in a blink. Only ever found, what, 20, 30 bodies?" "Something like that," Carl said, spitting over the side. "They say the rest are still down there, drifting, waiting." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the chill that had crept into my chest. Waiting for what? Henrik shrugged, his eyes distant. "Who knows? Maybe they're still looking for their way home." The words settled heavily in the air, and I found myself staring into the water, my imagination running wild. I pictured the wreckage of the jet, its crumpled fuselage resting on the seafloor. I imagined the passengers, suspended in the blackness, their lifeless bodies swaying with the currents like forgotten marionettes. The thought of it made my stomach turn, but I couldn't look away. "Funny thing," Carl said after a long pause. "Some folks say they've seen it. The plane, I mean. Say it rises up out of the fog sometimes, like it's still trying to land." Henrik snorted, but there was no humor in it. "Old wives' tales." "Maybe," Carl said, his voice trailing off. The quiet that followed was deafening. The fog seemed to press in closer, muffling even the gentle slap of the waves. I tried to focus on the fishing line in my hand, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the image of that ghostly plane and its lost passengers. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, a trick of light or shadow in the fog. But it was there, unmistakable, a dark shape moving beneath the surface, slow and deliberate. It was huge, much larger than any fish or whale I'd ever seen. My breath caught in my throat and I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. "Carl," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" He turned to look, squinting into the water. "See what?" "There," I said, pointing. The shape was gone, swallowed by the depths. For a moment I wondered if I'd imagined it, but then it appeared again, closer this time. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Henrik stood, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" None of us had an answer. The shape continued to rise, its edges becoming sharper, more defined. It was metallic, its surface dull and corroded. My stomach churned as the realization hit me. It was the fuselage of a plane. The three of us stood there, rooted to the spot as the wreckage breached the surface. It was massive, its twisted frame jutting out of the water like the skeleton of some long-dead beast. The windows were dark, empty holes that seemed to stare back at us. For a moment, everything was still. The fog hung thick around us, the only sound the faint creak of the metal as it settled. And then the screaming started. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was faint, distant, like the echo of a memory. But it grew louder, more desperate, filling the air with a sound that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of hundreds of voices crying out in anguish, their pain and fear bleeding into the fog. I wanted to run, to throw myself overboard and swim as far away as I could, but my legs wouldn't move. My hands gripped the rail so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I could feel the boat swaying beneath me, the water churning as if something was moving beneath the surface. And then they came. They rose from the water, their faces pale and bloated, their eyes empty sockets that seemed to see everything. Their arms reached out, fingers curling like claws. They were everywhere, surrounding the boat, their bodies drifting in the current. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the screams grew louder, piercing the fog and burrowing into my skull. Carl was shouting something, but I couldn't hear him over the noise. Henrik was on his knees, his hands pressed to his ears. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but no sound came. All I could do was stare as the dead closed in around us, their hollow eyes locked on mine. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The water was calm again, the fog silent and still. The wreckage was gone, as if it had never been there. Carl and Henrik were staring at me, their faces pale and drawn. None of us said a word. We simply turned the boat around and headed back to shore. I haven't been back to the sea since that day. I don't know what we saw out there, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. Story 8. It was 3 years ago, on a humid July evening, when I found myself on the deck of a fishing charter out of Key West. I'll never forget the way the salty breeze clung to my skin or the faint hum of diesel engines as we headed out into the Gulf Stream. The captain was a wiry man in his late 50s, weathered by years of sun and sea. He had a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor, and his eyes, narrow, calculating, seemed to carry secrets as deep as the ocean itself. There were 4 of us aboard, me, my buddy Mark, and a father-son duo from Jacksonville. It was supposed to be a routine blackfin tuna trip, nothing too extreme, just men in the sea, a cooler full of beer, and the promise of fishtails. I had no idea that night would haunt me to this day. We were drifting in a promising spot, lines in the water, waiting for the telltale pull of a tuna when I broke the silence. I wasn't expecting much, just idle chatter to pass the time. "Hey, Cap," I called out, leaning against the rail. "What's the strangest thing you've ever seen out here?" I expected a laugh or maybe a half-baked tale of giant squid or glowing UFOs dipping into the water. But the captain didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just froze for a second, his gaze locked on the horizon. And then, without so much as blinking, he said 6 words I'll never forget. "A dead elephant in the ocean." We all stared at him, the words hanging in the air like a bad smell. I chuckled nervously, thinking it was some kind of joke. "You're pulling our leg, right?" "Nope." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Happened back in the 80s, about 200 miles out. Big as a damn house, bloated, covered in gulls." A chill prickled my skin, And for the first time that night, the vast, dark ocean around us felt less like a playground and more like a predator. The father-son duo exchanged uneasy glances, and Mark muttered something about the captain having too much sun. The rest of the trip was uneventful, if you don't count the nagging sense of dread that crept in after that conversation. We pulled in a few decent-sized tunas, snapped some pictures, and headed back to the dock. I should have let it go. I should have filed the story away as an old sailor's tall tale. But then the captain told us something else as we were tying up at the dock. "Seen some messed up stuff out here," he said, almost to himself. "Hell, one time we were tied off behind a shrimp boat, pulling in grouper. Client reeled in a big one, mouth full of flesh, human flesh." The air went still. I stopped coiling my line and stared at him. "What the hell are you talking about?" "True story," he said, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. "Chunk of a knee joint, muscle still on it. Called the Coast Guard. They said it might have been a shrimper who fell overboard. Got tangled in the net. But between you and me," he exhaled a plume of smoke, "I don't think he fell." That was it. No explanation, no follow-up, just the cold, matter-of-fact tone of a man who'd seen enough horrors to know when to leave well enough alone. I barely slept that night. My dreams were filled with bloated elephants and severed limbs, floating aimlessly in the endless blue. Months went by. Life went on. I stopped thinking about the trip, convincing myself it was all just salty sailor nonsense. But then, about a year later, I saw something I can't explain. It was late November and I was out on a buddy's boat just off the Florida coast. We weren't far out, maybe 5 miles when we spotted it. At first it looked like a piece of driftwood, bobbing lazily in the swells. But as we got closer, I realized it wasn't wood. It was flesh, a carcass, bloated and pale, with patches of blackened skin peeling away like old paint. I couldn't tell what it was. It didn't look like any sea creature I'd ever seen. It was too big for a dolphin, too deformed for a whale, and the smell, God, the smell was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Rot and salt and something metallic, like blood. We circled it, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because as the boat drifted closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A hand. Not a flipper, not a fin. A human hand. Or what was left of it. The fingers were swollen and gray, the nails long and jagged. And clutching the base of the wrist was a long, barnacle-encrusted rope, tied tight enough to cut into the flesh. Mark swore under his breath, grabbing his phone to take a picture. But before he could, the carcass shifted, caught in the pull of the current. It rolled onto its side and we saw its face, or what was left of it. The features were unrecognizable, distorted by decay, but the hollow sockets where its eyes had been, they were staring right at us. We radioed the Coast Guard immediately, our voices barely coherent. They told us to stay put and wait for their arrival, but Mark was already turning the boat around. "Screw that," he muttered. "I'm not sticking around for this." We never did find out what the authorities made of it. They towed the body away, and we were left with nothing but questions. No answers, no closure. Just the haunting memory of that grotesque, bloated face staring back at us. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the captain was right, that the ocean is full of secrets we're better off not knowing. Story 9. I had spent most of my life chasing shadows in the deep, drawn to the mysteries of the ocean's depths. For years, I'd been leading blackwater dives, suspended in nothingness in the open ocean at night, where the world became an infinite void, punctuated only by the occasional flash of life. I lived for those moments of wonder and awe, but there were times the ocean revealed things that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. This story comes from one of those nights. We were far offshore, somewhere beyond the reach of city lights, where the stars blurred into the endless black above and below. The boat rocked gently as I briefed the divers. "Stay close to the downline," I said, my voice calm but firm. "It's easy to lose your sense of direction out there. Remember, there's nothing below us for 6,000 feet except darkness." It was my favorite line, a reminder of the isolation that added a sharp edge to every dive. Everyone nodded, and soon we were dropping into the abyss, each diver clipped to a tether so they couldn't drift too far. Beneath us, the world disappeared into a void so complete, it felt like falling into space. The first 30 minutes were uneventful. Plankton drifting like constellations, the occasional larval fish darting through our beams. Then came the squid. At first it was just one. Its body pulsed with bioluminescent streaks as it glided through the water, tentacles trailing like streamers. Soon more joined, their forms dancing just beyond our lights. Squids always added a surreal beauty to these dives, but tonight something felt different. There was an edge to their movements, a skittishness that set my nerves on edge. And then it happened. A shadow streaked into view, fast and deliberate. The squids scattered, but one wasn't quick enough. The shadow, no. A spotted dolphin slammed into it, jaws flashing as it tore into the squid. The water seemed to explode with movement, and I froze, watching in fascination and horror. The squid's body spasmed, its luminous patterns flaring wildly before fading. The dolphin darted off into the darkness, leaving behind a swirl of ink and glittering particles. Then I saw it. Something bright drifted down from the attack site, shimmering in my dive light. At first I thought it was just a fragment of the squid's body, a piece of cartilage or bioluminescent tissue. But it wasn't sinking like tissue should. It was heavier, deliberate in its descent. I swam closer, angling my light to get a better look. My stomach turned. It was the squid's eyeball, perfectly round, glistening, its pupil wide with shock. It spun slowly as it descended, catching the light like a grotesque pearl. I stared, transfixed, as it sank farther and farther below us, swallowed by the endless dark. I reached for my dive computer, realizing I'd been holding my breath. The soft beeping of it snapped me out of my trance, but my heart was still pounding. I gestured to one of the other divers, pointing down toward the abyss. They followed my light beam, their head tilting slightly in confusion, but they didn't understand. How could they? I turned my gaze downward again, but the eye was gone, just darkness below. We continued the dive, but the energy had shifted. The squids were gone, and the water felt heavier somehow, oppressive. Every shadow seemed to move. Every flicker in the corner of my vision felt like something just out of reach. I wanted to shake it off, to remind myself it was just the ocean playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. This time, it wasn't drifting. It was hanging there, far below us, just at the edge of the light. The same eye, or another one just like it. It glinted, catching the faint glow of our dive lights, but it wasn't falling anymore. It was watching. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I tried to tell myself it was just a reflection, a trick of the light, but the rational part of my brain was struggling to take hold. I motioned to the group to ascend, my hand trembling as I signed the signal. As we rose, I glanced down one last time, unable to resist the pull of my own fear. The eye was still there, impossibly far below us now, but somehow still clear, still visible. It didn't sink. It didn't blink. It just stayed, staring. Back on the boat, I barely spoke as we stowed our gear. The divers were chatting, laughing about the dolphin and the squids, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back. I kept glancing at the water, half expecting to see that unblinking eye bobbing at the surface, waiting. The rest of the crew chalked my silence up to fatigue, but even now, years later, I can't explain what I saw. I've led hundreds of dives since, but I've never seen anything like it again. Story 10. The night we went out off the coast of Massachusetts started like any other. The sea was calm, the air cold, but the thrill of the chase was already starting to kick in. I'd been on these trips countless times, a weekend ritual with the same crew of guys who shared the same obsession for tuna fishing. Every time we went out, the ocean felt a little more like home, a little more familiar, though there was always something about the deep darkness of the open sea at night that felt unnerving, even after years of doing it. It was around midnight when the surreal feeling really hit me. We were about 12 hours offshore, the boat humming along, but in all directions, there was only the vast blackness. Nothing. No lights on the horizon, no shoreline visible. just the endless, oppressive void of the ocean. The only sounds were the waves slapping against the hull and the occasional groan of the boat's engine. Then came the first strange sound. It was distant, almost like a low hum, but it wasn't mechanical. It felt alive. A whale maybe, or something else. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel the tension on the boat shift. The other guys tried to shrug it off, joking around about how we were too far out, and maybe the whales were trying to have a conversation. But there was something off about it. The noise seemed to come from all directions, not just from one point in the ocean. It was as if something huge, something massive, was circling us in the dark. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "Yeah," one of the guys, Jake, answered. "Just some whales. It's fine. Happens all the time." I nodded, trying to push down the unease gnawing at my stomach. But the sound persisted, louder now. It wasn't just whales. It felt like there was something else out there. Something far more ominous. Something closer. But as the guys started reeling in their lines, the sound faded, and I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. We went quiet, each of us focused on our rods, hoping for the big catch. The only light came from the dim glow of the boat's instruments and a single spotlight cast over the side. It didn't take long for the sounds to come back, sharper this time. A deep rumble echoed beneath the boat, vibrating through the hull. My hands gripped the railings and I could feel my heart starting to race. "What the hell was that?" I muttered under my breath. No one answered. The other guys had heard it too. We were all trying to pretend it was just the normal creaks and groans of the boat. Normal for a boat this far out, but none of us could shake the feeling that it wasn't. The water around us felt too quiet, too still. Then the light flickered, just once, like a brief stutter, a crackle. The shadows around us felt thicker, as if the darkness itself was pressing in. I stared out into the open ocean, trying to peer through the night. Nothing. No stars, no moon, just blackness. A quiet, suffocating blackness. Then out of nowhere, I heard something behind me. A strange, almost human sound. It was soft at first, a murmur, like someone whispering my name. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, but no one was there. The guys were still busy with their fishing gear, oblivious, but the whisper, it lingered. It wasn't one of them. I called out, my voice unsteady, "Who's messing with me?" No response. I took a slow step toward the stern of the boat, my eyes scanning the dark water. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't tell what. My breath caught in my throat as a shadow passed just beneath the surface. Huge, massive. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. "Jake!" I shouted, but my voice cracked. I was suddenly aware of how tiny and alone we were, out here in the middle of the ocean. Jake looked up. "What? What's going on?" But before I could answer, there was a loud bang, a violent thud against the side of the boat. I felt it in my bones. It shook the entire hull. We all froze, staring into the void. "Did anyone feel that?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "Yeah, I felt it." "What the hell was that?" Jake replied, his eyes wide now. A ripple of unease spread through the crew. We were on high alert now. We didn't know what it was, but something was wrong. I could feel the ocean itself holding its breath, like it was waiting for something to happen. And then came the whispers again, softer, but now unmistakable. I swear I heard them all around me, like they were coming from the deep, from below. My stomach twisted and my throat went dry. I couldn't explain it, but the ocean felt like it was pressing in on us, as if the blackness was more than just the absence of light. It was something alive, something ancient. The sounds, the whispers, they came from everywhere now. At first I thought it was just the wind, but I knew better. The guys were tense now, their hands shaking as they held onto the boat, all of us staring into the dark, terrified to look away. My breath came in shallow gasps as a strange pressure built around us. It felt like something was closing in. The boat lurched again, violently this time, as if something massive had slammed into it. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't the sea. It was something else. My pulse was thundering in my ears as I gripped the side of the boat, my knuckles white. "Get ready to start pulling in the lines," Jake yelled, but there was a tremor in his voice. It was like he was trying to hold it together, but I could see the fear in his eyes. And then, silence. The whispers stopped. The ocean calmed. The darkness felt deeper than before, suffocating. But before I could even process what was happening, there was a loud snap, like a rope breaking. I spun around to see the line on one of the rods violently jerk, and the reel screamed as something massive tore at it. Jake cursed. "What the hell is going on?" I couldn't look away. The line was pulling in the opposite direction. So hard, so fast, it seemed impossible. And then, just as suddenly, it all stopped. The reel went slack. The boat fell into complete, unnerving quiet. The water around us was still, empty, as if nothing had happened at all. The crew exchanged looks. We all felt it. The unspoken truth between us all. Whatever that was, whatever happened, it wasn't just the ocean. We weren't alone out there. We stayed quiet for the rest of the night, eyes darting around, hearts racing, the sound of the boat cutting through the water, the only thing that kept us tethered to reality.